Hello everyone, it's Silver. This is Mekkablood, Quarry Assault. This time we've got a retro shooter that's going for more of like the 16-bit era art style, which you don't usually see with these, so that's kind of interesting. And as you can see, you're piloting a mech in this game. And one thing I really like is that you're kind of slow. You're big and stompy. This is not a fast mech. So the movement in this game feels kind of weighty, which is really good in my opinion for something where you're supposed to be piloting a mech. It feels really nice. And also you do have a little bit of a dodge capability, but it's not a lot. You can strafe left or right or sprint forward for some extra speed, and you've got this turbo gauge at the top of the screen there that shows you how much of it you have, but it drains really fast, so you can't do this a whole bunch. So you're not really meant to be zipping around the arenas in this game. Instead, you're sort of trudging along, plodding in this huge mech, and going through big rooms full of enemies. As far as how the game looks, it's kind of neat, in my opinion. You've got some really odd tile sets here and there. You'll find that pretty much every level has its own tile set, which is really nice. This way, the game does not get repetitive visually. You'll find that pretty much each map has something unique about it that helps you tell it apart from the others. Even if it's not a big change, like a completely different wall texture, there will still be some other changes that make it different. The enemy sprites are really nice looking. You're fighting entirely mechanical enemies, given that you are in a mech, so are all your enemies. And some of them are also like little sort of security bots, your smaller non-manned things. Some of these can be really dangerous too, like the ones that explode when they get close to you. Those are a huge problem, but more on that later. The mech that you're in looks very cool. You don't see it exactly, but you can see a little representation of it in the middle of the screen, and it's also in some of the game art and stuff. It's a really cool looking machine. And also, you'll find that there are some enemies that are in mechs more like yours, so these are effectively like the boss battles of the game. I mean, the music even changes when you encounter them to let you know that they're around, and they're definitely a lot stronger than pretty much any other machine you'll face, so that's cool. A little bit of extra variety. The enemy variety overall, I'd say, is pretty solid in this game. It's not extreme, but it is good enough for the length of the game, I feel. Speaking of the length of the game, a full playthrough took me about 5 hours, but I missed a lot of secrets. So I think that's actually a pretty fair length for the style that we're going for here. We're going for a retro shooter, we're going for something that is like a one and done campaign, and I think it does that job pretty well. Another thing you'll notice when playing is that each level has its own music, which was an unexpected little thing that I really enjoyed. The music is very much in the metal adjacent sort of genre, but it's not like the sort of jinty progressive metal of Doom or something like that. It's a little bit different, and it kind of varies from like a more traditional standard metal to more like a sort of groove metal a la like Pantera or something, to a little bit of almost punk inspired stuff in certain areas. So there's a good amount of variety to the music actually, and I definitely appreciated how it changes every stage. That's another thing that helps the stages feel more unique, is that they all have their own soundtrack. So that was a pretty good decision, I feel, by the developer to give each one their own soundtrack. Definitely an appreciated little touch. As far as weapons go, you've got quite a few to choose from. You have 4 different ammo types, standard like bullets, shotgun shells, rockets, and energy cells. And you'll find several weapons for each ammo type. Because of this, the arsenal feels pretty well rounded, and you've got a good mixture of like projectile and hit scan style weapons. And the way that it seems to work is that you'll find a weapon that uses a certain ammo type, and then later on throughout the campaign you'll find a sort of improved version of that weapon. It seems like basically that's how it works. The arsenal is a set of base level guns and then an improved version of each of them that you'll find as you go. The improved rocket launcher is a lot of fun to use, and was actually sort of like my main weapon throughout a lot of the game after I found it, because it's just really effective and pretty easy to lead your targets with and stuff, given that a lot of the environments are relatively close in. You do have some areas with much longer sight lines and stuff, but a lot of the areas are hallways and things like that that are a little bit more claustrophobic. But I was also a fan of the upgraded shotgun that does a lot of damage, but you have to be very close to an enemy to be able to hit them, and of the improved sort of energy blasters that fire those rapid fire projectiles. Those are a lot of fun to use too. So I would say the arsenal is pretty good. In this game it does a good job of feeling like a classic retro shooter arsenal, which is clearly what it's going for, but flavored through a mecha lens. You do also have dual buzzsaws that you'll have from the start of the game. These are nice if you run out of all your other ammo types, but they're also useful for breaking open crates. There are crates everywhere in this game that have various supplies in them, and you'll want these because the enemy density is very high in all the maps, so you're going to be doing a lot of combat and going through lots of ammo, so finding these crates is key to your survival. They also have some shields and armor in them to keep yourself healthy. The normal weapons do not have alt fires, but your buzzsaws do, and it's available at any time just by right-clicking. You can just tap the right-click to auto-switch to the buzzsaws quickly, which is a nice little thing, but also you can hold the right-click down in order to sort of dash forward. This uses some of your turbo gauge and lets you do a quick forward dash to close some distance to an enemy or go through some sort of hazard more quickly. So probably the most interesting thing to me about looking at classic style shooters, like retro shooters, is the map design, because especially when they're made by a very small team or indeed one person, the map design gives you a really good glimpse into sort of how they want the game to play, into what they think that you should be doing. Basically, map design is sort of like their artistic imprint to you, right? It's like a way for the developer to communicate directly to the player. And after playing through it, I think I've got the map design of this developer figured out. I think I've got their main ideas. So for one, you'll find that a lot of the levels are split between combat areas and I guess you could call them platforming areas. It's not about jumping. You don't really jump much in this game, if at all. You do have a jump, but it's very small. But it's about avoiding hazards like crushers or traveling fast blocks or lava or acid or something like that. You'll find that the maps are split sort of evenly between lots of combat areas and lots of these puzzly, platformy areas where you have to get around hazards instead of enemies. These can be very exacting areas that were, for me, the hardest part of the game, especially the fast-moving blocks and the laser grids. Those were a bit tricky. It's all timing-based, of course. You got to get the right timing to jet in between the fast-moving hazards to get through safely, but it can get very difficult sometimes, especially when just barely touching any of these things is often instant death. The game does have a checkpoint system, so you don't necessarily have to repeat the entire stage over again if you die, although that depends, because really the only time you're going to find a checkpoint, an actual save point in a stage, is right before you get a colored key to unlock a new door. Basically, those are the only spots where the game saves. So you'll be going through these levels, getting room after room full of enemies, and then you'll come across some sort of other hazard that you've got to beat that doesn't involve normal combat. And then once you get past that hazard, there's usually a bunch more enemies, and then eventually the end of the level. So you could kind of say that the levels are structured in this sort of ascending difficulty sense, where you start in a relatively calm environment and encounter more and more dense packs of enemies and hazards along the way. But the biggest, the main sort of feature of the maps, the most common thing that I noticed in terms of how they're designed, is that this developer really likes to give you two separate paths at once, allowing you to go down either one. One of them will have a key at the end, the other one will have the door that you need that key to unlock at the end. So you'll notice throughout almost all of these maps, they have a structure like that. They have a spot where they diverge into two separate paths that you can take either one, and you will fight through various enemies and hazards to get to the end of each one, and at the end of one you'll find the key you need, and at the end of the other you'll be able to use that key. And if you do happen to go to the wrong one first, then it's not a problem because enemies don't respawn unless you die. This means that the levels are relatively open because there usually are multiple paths for you to take at once, but I don't think it really gets confusing to navigate because this game doesn't have a map, which immediately scared me at first, but it turns out it doesn't really need one because for the most part the exploration you're doing is through corridors and rooms that are connected in a linear fashion, which means it's hard to get lost. There are areas that are more open with more different connections and different Z levels and things that make things more complicated, but I noticed even in those, the game was still very easy to navigate, mostly because the developer did a good job of, for one, posting enemies around so that you know areas you haven't been to yet because they're full of enemies. That's always a good sign. But also by making the geometry not repeat itself. So when you see a specific room in a map, it's usually easy to remember where that room is because it won't look exactly like any other room. The maps may have repeating textures and things because each one has its own tile set, but they don't get so repetitive looking that they all look the same and it becomes hard to navigate. They usually have differences in level geometry and things that make them easy to remember. Oh, this was the side that had all this stuff, so I need to go to the other side through that door to get to the key. At no point while playing did I ever really find myself lost. I think probably the most complicated level is this one that is 3 levels high and has a whole bunch of side rooms and stuff in them, many of which are dead ends but give you supplies, so they're still useful to go through if you're having trouble. But even this much more complex level was still easy to navigate because the 3 floors look a bit different and allowed you to find different keys at different levels and things. And generally speaking, the developer does a good job of whenever you get a key and you go out and exit in that room, the thing you'll see will lead you to the door you need to go to. So you don't have to wander through the level for a really long time wondering which of the doors you found this key goes to. Usually there's sort of like a sight line when you leave that room that tells you, hey, that way, go in that direction towards those enemies and stuff, and you'll find the door. So I think that honestly the map design in this game is pretty solid because it does a good job of signposting and making sure you don't get lost and wander around areas for too long, making sure things don't look too visually repetitive to where areas look too similar to tell them apart, things like that, just avoiding a lot of those common pitfalls. And it ultimately results in a campaign that is pretty short. Like I said, it's about 5 hours long-ish, depending on the amount of secrets you're looking for and stuff. But a campaign that feels well-paced. And the fact that each level is pretty different and has its own soundtrack and everything means that you are going to feel a good sense of progression as you go from level to level, rather than going through a bunch of stuff that continually keeps looking the same. The campaign is also helped by the fact that there's a little bit of voice acting in the beginning of each level. There's some almost like Redneck Rampage flavored voice acting, which may not be a game that you wanted to think about right now, but it does sort of remind me of that. And the ending is sufficiently satisfying for the journey that you went through to get there, right? It's not quite a you did it congratulations style of ending. There's a little bit more to it than that, a little bit of extra substance. This is not a game that's heavy on the story, but it does have just enough to give you a bit of a framework for what you're doing. Overall, I think it's a pretty solid game if you're in the market for a very retro shooter, something that doesn't have a lot of bells and whistles, no upgrade systems, no skill trees, no experience, no RPG elements or anything like that, just a very classic feeling shooter, but mecha flavored, then I'd say give it a shot. So I'll put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page for Mekkablood if you wish to check it out yourselves. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.